Hello, guys, and welcome to my NFL draft pick analysis video of the first four teams. I am going to be starting, essentially with, Arizona's division. We're kind of just going to go in order of their, respective teams in their division, and I'm going to grade, their picks. I'm here on ESPN just to kind of look and see if there's anything that I kind of overlooked or, and that sort of thing. I was at the draft, I do have my own opinions on certain players, and, there are some players that I'm definitely like, man, this is a home run hit. This is a great, pick for this team. Whereas there will be times that I'll be like, I don't think this was a great pick. But without further ado, let's start off with Arizona, and then we're going to move on to the rest of the division with Arizona, the Seahawks, the Niners, and the Rams, of course. But starting off with the Arizona Cardinals, their first pick was Walter Nolan at pick 15. Pick 16, excuse me. So we've got Walter Nolan here. Is addressing a need. This is actually a pick that I really liked for Arizona. Walter Nolan was kind of criticized out of Ole Miss for having off the field issues. And I was like, if he teams up with Calais Campbell, who's the model citizen of, honestly, the NFL. Like, I don't think there's really anyone else that you could be like, oh, nobody's probably respected more than Calais Campbell. But you bring in Walter Nolan, and he overall just has a lot of upside still. Very, very good player. I'm giving this grade an A. I will say that A plus is the highest I'll go, I guess, with a grade, even though A plus seems kind of cliche. And then the lowest grade I think that I'll give is probably a D. I'm not going to give any of these Fs. I think grading is kind of weird in general. I probably should have mentioned a little bit earlier. We obviously don't know how any of these guys will pan out, but you can analyze the pick for the need and the potential, is kind of what I'm looking for here. And also like what they gave up for the pick and that sort of thing, and it's like, well, you probably won't analyze a lot of players based on the trades and that sort of thing because there weren't a lot of trades in this. But obviously, Walter Nolan, solid player, addresses a need and fills, a void, on this team, because we all know Calais Campbell, I feel like he's likely to retire a Cardinal here, being his first team. Moving on to their second pick, we have Will Johnson. He did fall, and it was one of those interesting things that, hey, this guy could be the best corner in this draft type of thing, but it was a injury concern. And it's kind of one of those things that it's like, if a guy can't stay healthy, it doesn't matter how good he is, but I do think that this was insane value for this pick. I'm giving this an A minus because it's like, you get a guy in the second round that is arguably, second at his position rank, and you could argue you first overall just because Travis Hunter was an anomaly, and one of those rare unicorn-like players, and he may not even play at DB a lot at Jacksonville. I think that, Jacksonville does need a DB and a wide receiver, but that's kind of another topic for another video. I think Will Johnson was a great pickup for the Cardinals, and they got incredible value here, should he stay healthy. Moving on to their third pick, you have Jordan Birch. They did need edge on this team, and I really liked, Jordan Birch has great size. He is, a little bit on the heavy side, I guess, but overall, I think that he's a player that, has a lot of, kind of upside still, and this great, and he has great size, and a lot of the edges in this draft were kind of like, on, on the fringe of like, would you like this size? And it's like, no, but they have talent. And Jordan Birch isn't that way. And, overall he can come in and he can be, be a good starter, a stalwart on this defense eventually, and, at a position of need. Now will he fill that edge rush kind of as well as they would like him to? Maybe, maybe not. But I am going to give this grade a B+. No, I'm not just going down, the grades, guys, from A to A- to B+ here. It's just kind of coincidental in the sense that he's not the best edge, and it's like, will he be able to, produce type of thing. Cody Simon, a linebacker. I thought this pick was kind of interesting. I don't really think that, this team was a team that had a really linebacker issue, I guess, and that sort of thing. But they get a guy here who is, quick reaction time, good at playing the pass, good tackler too with 112, obviously. And it's, stays square, good technique, and that sort of thing, and isn't afraid, which is, really good. And it looks like a very good all-around player to have got in the 4th round. Obviously, position rank, he is the 6th rated, and to get that in the 4th round, I'm going to give this one, because it's not a position of need, I'm going to give it a B-, to be honest with you. I think Cody Simon, well, it's a decent pickup. I don't think it was the need for this team, a team that, missed out on wide receivers and could have definitely gotten one in the 4th round and that sort of thing. Denzel Burke, another corner. They ended up, getting this as a trade and that sort of thing. Obviously a little shorter and a lighter corner, probably a nickel corner, if pretty obvious here. Good body control and, press man coverage, and has good hip motion from what I can see here. So travels the ball and that sort of thing. And he has small hands, but to me, it's like, it looks like he has good hand skills, and overall he's a scrappy defender. And, being able to play well on special teams, that's just an added bonus. But we'll see if Denzel Burke, makes any sort of starting. But I am glad they solidified on corner, because they definitely haven't had good cornerback play for, several years in Arizona. And it's just, getting more weapons for this team, very much more important. I'm going to give this Denzel Burke a B grade for a guy who looks like, he essentially could potentially become a starter with some more polish or something like that. But moving on to, round 6 for them, we have Hayden Conner. Hayden Conner, obviously trade from, Dallas and that sort of thing. A big guard, 6'6", 314. I like it. Big school, position rank of 19, and that sort of thing. Definitely a big guy, and very good at tracking, and strong enough to anchor. I think this is a solid pick. I don't think that the Cardinals have the worst O-line in the league. Obviously some of that is because Kyler is so good at escaping, but I think it's always good to add, to your O-line. You never know who's going to slip up. You never know when you're going to need depth because of injuries. I'm going to give this grade a B. So last pick, we have Keaton Crawford, a safety out of Nevada. Obviously kind of a stockier guy, not big for any means and that sort of thing. He led the team in tackles, which is kind of, crazy to me. And Keaton Crawford, good ball skills and, slips blocks, and he and he wraps up, and also good special teams. I think this guy is a good pickup. I do think that you look at the Cardinals, and Buda Baker definitely needs some help. I think that he's a good player, but I think that he does need, the other side of the field, I think, has gotten exposed. And whether or not that's also due to the poor cornerback play, but addressing their secondary heavily as the biggest, spot where they addressed with, 3 picks to the secondary, I think is good. But if he doesn't start right away, I would have said to, take a flyer on one of these late round wide receivers, because there definitely was a good amount of good wide receivers in this class. And unless Marvin Harrison takes a major leap to where he's a solo dominant threat on this team, which is possible, I think it's, kind of a blow that you didn't draft a wide receiver at all. I'm going to give the Keaton Crawford grade a B-. The overall grade I would grade for this draft, as I think that they did a pretty good job, to be honest with you. I think that, I'm going to give the Cardinals a B+ on this draft. And we are going to move on to, the next team, in their division. And we've got the Rams. So the Rams didn't have a first overall pick in this draft. Tight end was a big need of theirs. I guess it doesn't really say it here, which is kind of ironic. I'm pretty sure, it was a big need of theirs, and there was theories of them going Loveland should he have made it to their pick, but he was grabbed by the Bears. Terrence Ferguson being their first pick in the second round, you've got this pick from Atlanta, and, a guy who's 6'5", borderline 250 pounds, fifth rank. I think, with the amount of reception work this guy got and the amount of touchdowns, I think this guy is going to be very, very, very solid with Stafford. And I love this pick. And he ran the fastest. And he's, still a big guy, 6'5", 247, Obviously, the comparison, with kind of height and weight of someone who Stafford has played with previously would be Megatron. Obviously, Megatron was like 6'5", 240, but this guy is just a little bit heavier, and clearly doesn't run as fast as, Megatron does. But, Stafford, with the ball placement and experience he has, I expect this guy to be utilized. You've got, Adams, Puka, Ferguson. I forget their other tight end that I'm glad they brought back, and that sort of thing. And then Tutu Atwell, I guess, don't really consider him too much of their focal point. But like the Rams grabbing this guy, I think, spells danger, as this guy could easily be racking up yards or be a very reliable red zone threat when you already have Puka and Devontae Adams, who are big guys who can fight for a ball in the end zone. So it's like overall, they add to a strength. I think, if the Rams, it's like if they had Ferguson last year, they maybe could have beat the Eagles in their game, coming very, very, very close to beating, the Eagles. But this edition, very, very good. I am going to give this an A+, actually, because I think it really, McVay is going to be able to make this guy do amazing things, And then we go on to the second round. We have Josiah Stewart and edge. I would not say edge was a huge need for them, but clearly this guy, was kind of, maybe he's a guy that they throw in on pass rush downs, being, 250 pounds, 6'1". He's obviously, a little bit shorter and lighter than most of what you would want, but he's quick, with this kind of height and range. And it's like, the likes of, I'm trying to remember his name from last year that they drafted. More of a power guy. You do need some electricity and speed and that sort of thing to give quarterback's reason to panic. So I don't and I don't think it's ever bad to add another edge rusher. You never know who's going to really have the hot hand, and maybe this guy comes in and does well. But regardless of it not being a need, and I do think that guy with good size and that sort of thing. I'm going to give this a B, as just because it is a high value position. I think if this guy produces at all behind a pretty good pass rusher. Jarquez Hunter out of Auburn, running back. Obviously a guy who is shorter, stocky, 5'9" at 204 out of Auburn. This guy, and he runs fast. This guy reminds me, and hate on me if you want, of like a Ray Rice. Ray Rice was a stocky, short guy with pretty respectable speed. Obviously 4'4" is not a crazy blazer speed, but this guy could disappear behind the O-line and, jump out. And besides Kyren Williams, you really didn't have anybody else, and I agree with this. And I think that the Rams know that Kyren Williams was a little bit injured last year, and overall, I think looking at Jarquez Hunter here, in the 4th round, who could be an instant sort of playmaker, I'm going to give this grade an A. Then we go and we see Ty Hamilton out of Ohio State, D tackle, 6'3", 300, very, very, very strong, here, obviously is one of those things. Obviously, with this kind of team, I think that they did kind of suffer a little bit against the run. Not that it was crazy bad, but I do remember, I think that some of the edge that the Eagles had was that, they were able to, break some decent sized runs. And it was more often than not than Saquon obviously did. And it's not like it's not like they had a bad run defense. It's just, man, the overpowering element of the run game of the Eagles last year. But it's like you look at this and it's like, I think that, they added a stalwart here. Does he see playing time right away? And, most bench reps at the combine, the stoutest guy. I am going to give this a B+, as it is, not a position of need, but it looks like they got a guy, that I could say that I like, who played for a big school and, can be an instant impact. Now, Chris Paul Jr., I'm very happy for this pick for the Rams. And I'll be real with you guys. I'm kind of looking at CB here, and the fact that they didn't draft one, I am actually okay with it. I thought that the DB play wasn't that bad, and it's like, yeah, they have a bunch of, I guess nobodies, is what people say. But I don't think that, if you can have a pass rush send home, like the way that this team did last year, I think that you can, the corners are scrappy enough. They're scrappy enough, on the Rams to be good enough, to be honest with you. But looking at Chris Paul, I honestly thought that he would go a little bit earlier than this. Maybe that's a bold take. He's obviously he's more of a, obviously a safety build right here and that sort of thing. But he led, Ole Miss in tackles, and, he transferred from Arkansas, and, explosion, good speed, and, seems to be a very smart guy. Maybe it's just because he's not at a luxury position, even though we've seen a lot of these great teams nowadays with good linebacker play, and that sort of thing. So obviously, he's a little bit undersized, could have, a little bit of a mismatch type of thing against NFL caliber tight ends. But I think that with his speed and that sort of thing, he's going to be able to shoot gaps and, go for hits on running backs and that sort of thing. So even as a pass rusher, being a smaller, quicker guy, I think that this is a very good, pickup. I think it's funny they compare him to Nick Bolton because Nick Bolton's a bit bigger in size. But Nick Bolton, as we all know, is one of the top middle linebackers in the league. So Chris Paul in the 5th round, I'm going to give this A minus, And then we move on to their last pick. We have Konata Mumfield. I'm not going to lie, I don't think I know much about this guy. The 42 position rank, and that sort of thing, 5'11", 186, obviously kind of a smaller guy, and did get open and created a lot of, averaged a good amount of yards and that sort of thing. And, they say he can line up wide as well. That's kind of unique for a guy that it's like, does well after the catch. And they kind of need that sort of guy. You have Puka that can get open and make these tough catches. Adams can definitely create space, not like he once used to, and that sort of thing. And then Tutu Atwell, obviously, we'll see if he's, replaced by Mumfield. Highly unlikely, being that he's a 7th rounder. But overall, a kid here to me that just adds needed depth to this team, because I do think that they've suffered from injuries in the past. And, I'm going to give Mumfield, I'm going to give this a B minus, just because I think that he does add value and a potential replacement to Tutu eventually. But he's not going to, possibly contribute right away unless it's on, punt returns or kick returns or something like that. Now, moving on, we have 2 more teams in this video, and we're going to go to we'll go from Seattle to San Fran. So Seattle, we got, Gray Zabel in the 1st round. This guy was a dude with really good size, really good height. Looks like a guy who it's like didn't start a lot, as everyone knows, but that sort of thing. And he looks like he has a crazy broad jump, which means he has good stepping capability for a taller guy. It is imperative that these taller guys are able to move side to side if they're going to play tackle. I have heard that some people say he's going to go and he's going to play at guard until they actually need him at tackle, which was obviously guard, they say, was the 2nd most need, but offensive tackle, 4th most need, and that sort of thing. So it's like Zabel, I think, was a great pick. I don't think this needs much talking about. I don't think it was as big of a reach as anybody may say and that sort of thing. And he's definitely a guy that, whether or not he plays guard or tackle, can fill, 2 need, 1 need at a time, obviously on this O-line, but an O-line that struggled to protect Geno last year, and you want to protect your investment in Sam Darnold, but I'm going to give this grade. I'm honestly going to give it an A+, because I think he has a chance to really be, that kind of crazy of a pick. And then we move on to Nick Emenwari. Obviously, they traded up here from Tennessee. They took the pick from Tennessee. And, Nick Emenwari, a 6'3", 220-pound guy. He's the most, to me, that looks like, and RAS, obviously a perfect 10. This guy's a freak athlete, and I think he just rose up boards because of that appeal. Like, you can't teach that level of athleticism. That's just not a thing. So if you can mold this guy, and you look at who, you look at who the Seahawks have had in the past, this to me screams like a guy that looks like he's got the speed of Earl Thomas, but the size of like a Cam Chancellor. So it's just crazy to me that, they went up and they got their guy, which, I definitely did not mind. I think this was one of the smarter picks, 40-inch vertical on a safety, sub 4.4, and that sort of thing. And, crazy since 2003. Like, it just sounds like he's a generational athlete at the very least. And teams are not going to throw deep on this guy. And that's the kind of defense that I expect McDonald to run under a team where it's like, oh, you could be a dip and dime sort of, offense where it's like you're running a lot and you're sucking away the clock, and these teams are going to have a hard time playing catch up with Love and Emin up there. I'm giving this grade an A plus, and that sort of thing. I don't think much else needs to be said about it, and position rank, I guess they ranked him 1 here, and I just think is good value. And then Elijah Arroyo, a tight end, good size, similar to the guy we looked at over on the Rams, obviously. But they did get this guy in the 3rd round. The 2nd round, picks later. Excuse me. Obviously, he missed most of these with like a knee injury. And, averaging just under 17 yards a catch is pretty freakish. I think this guy looked really, really, really good. And, Trey McBride burst on the scene last year. If you've got a guy like this alongside JSN, Cooper Kupp, and then I forget their 3rd wide receiver, but I honestly think that they're trying to kind of revamp this offense. They could have him and Noah Fant. I'm pretty sure Noah Fant is still on this team, both playing and creating big mismatches or even having big sets where, hey, these guys are blocking for theirs guys. And, obviously not the strongest guy getting shed and at times, but, perhaps you deceive a run play and you let this guy loose because he looked really, really speedy for a tight end. And I'm going to give this grade, because even though it wasn't like that big of a need, but wide receiver, was a need. And it's like, tight ends in today's day and age like this, they're like a big tight end, and they can fulfill that role in a sense. I'm going to give this grade an A minus, only because of the injury concern with him. Jalen Milroe. I theorized that the Seattle Seahawks may draft a quarterback later in the rounds. I didn't think this early, to be honest. Now, Milroe obviously started 2 seasons, 39 touchdowns, 17 interceptions, he obviously freak athlete type of thing, has the size and that sort of thing. And it's like, 20 touchdowns and 726 yards. If they can if they can take off like 7 of those interceptions or something like that, then this guy's looking like a crazy talent. And he gets time to sit because we know he's not going to be playing right away with the but they don't need to have him play right away, and he can kind of learn, and be patient and, work on his own craft. And he could be a very dangerous player if Sam Darnold doesn't really work out, which is always a possibility. But I'm going to give this Jalen Milroe pick just because I think it was a little high, and I feel like there were other guys that you still could have picked, later. I'm going to give this pick a B minus. I think it was a little bit high, to be honest with you. But, overall, it could turn into like an A grade in years if he ends up proving to be a generational talent or something like that. Now, Riley Mills, D tackle. Not a position of need in my opinion, but a 6'5", 291 D tackle that is, he tore his right ACL, unfortunately, and he has good size. I don't really feel like I know Riley Mills that much. He obviously has a good work ethic, as it says here. He looks like a guy who's a great value pick in round 5, and a good depth piece, and potentially a starter in the future, to me. But obviously a guy that, wasn't a position need. I don't know how much I like this pick, I guess. Riley Mills looks like he's a high effort character. So maybe in the 5th round, I guess, there is some value there where it's like this guy works and works and works. Did go to a big school, but otherwise I'm kind of looking at this pick and I'm thinking, Lowest grade of this review, I'm going to say C+. Torrey Horton. I actually think that Torrey Horton was a really, 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 really good pick right here for Seattle. I think that they definitely needed wide receiver. Torrey Horton was a kid that a lot of people liked and, that sort of thing. And he's a guy that has good size, is tall, did go to Colorado State, not the same one that Shador coached at, you guys. But this guy, I like this pick. And in the fifth, the bottom of the fifth round, which, I thought was where he would go, I think this was a very good pick for Seattle. I think they're going to be very, very happy. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Horton, Kupp, and JSN on day one as the starting three for this team, with obviously Horton and Kupp on the outside, and then you have JSN working the slot, as good as he is there. I don't think this really needs that much talking about, to be honest with you. I think this guy is a good guy with sure hands as well, which, Darnold was kind of used to. The Vikings didn't drop a lot of footballs last year, and good size. I'm going to give this grade an A because I think they got good value from out of Horton in the bottom of the fifth round. And, goodness, quite a grab here. Moving on to Robbie Outs, another tight end. Compensatory 6'3", 274. He's obviously a run blocker style, which, I guess I didn't look at over these beforehand, but maybe you are pulling out your other tight end, Arroyo, earlier to have this guy run block, because 274, this guy is a beefy tight end. Obviously walls off defenders, the last thing I think you want with guys like, Kenneth Walker the third, and then even Charbonnet, to be honest with you, is to give them any sort of space. And I think that if you're running more towards the edge, you have to worry less about the interior, which was a weak point to this Seattle team last year. It's why, guard is one of their needs, is that running up the middle was not very effective last year. It's why Geno had to throw a lot of kind of deep balls. He was leading the league in yards, early on, and it's just the run game was just bad, which shouldn't be with guys like Charbonnet and K-Walk. But I'm going to give this grade, honestly, even with, this guy not being, Robbie Outs not being, not being a receiver type, because I think they addressed that with, their offseason moves and draft picks. I'm actually going to give this a B. I think it's a solid pickup. Obviously, teams are going to be kind of aware that this dude isn't out there for receptions. Perhaps you use him as a decoy that way on potential play actions or, RPOs, to make them think that, because he is, this guy is a big bodied guy, easy to throw the ball to. But yeah, I'm going to give it a B. Just because it's I think there was other positions of need and you could have gotten more value. Bryce Cabeldue, offensive tackle, a big guy, similar to Zabel, crazy enough, out of Kansas. They say he might need to move to guard and that sort of thing, and he has good push. Obviously, I think that there is a solid shot that this guy plays in at guard and that sort of things. But hand placement inconsistent, that sort of thing, which is never good when you're trying to, run defend or pass defend and that sort of thing, but obviously good movement for a guy his size. And I feel like we're seeing kind of more and more of this, of these linemen that are perfecting their craft and being able to move really well at these, big sizes, just so that you can have more plethora of run scheme, type of things, kind of similar to how the Eagles did it last year. And you see these teams going for it. And it's that is not what I would want to see, with a guy like Kenneth Walker, being able to go home every single day. Damian Martinez, running back. Now, I wouldn't say running back was like a need for this team, but they do get so many injuries, Charbonnet, Kenneth Walker, and that sort of thing that, it's not bad to solidify, and obviously this guy, didn't have crazy production in 2 seasons, but had good production, and that sort of thing. And, became the first Hurricane running backs to do, that crazy. And he obviously a stronger guy, 6 foot, 217, and that sort of thing. And, moves well laterally. This guy looks like a pick that's very, very smart, might see some playing time, to be honest with you. And, even average good on the catch. So it's like a guy that can go out of the backfield and that sort of thing. So if you're afraid of him running at you, up the middle, but they do like a play action, he can also dip out and, dunk on teams. I'm going to give this Damian Martinez pick. I think, this guy looks like he's going to find his spot in Seattle. And I'm going to give this a B+ as well. Mason Richmond, another tackle. They really, addressed their O-line, which I commend the Seattle on doing. Like, there's the 3 quickest ways to getting your team, your offense and your defense going. It all starts with the line, D-line, O-line, as far as I'm concerned. And then all the other pieces will sort themselves out eventually. Another dude who's similar in size to their other 2 draft picks. This is kind of crazy, right? He started 52 games at left tackle and that sort of things. And, moves well, doesn't take false steps, everything. This guy sounds like he's very, very composed. I can't say that I know who Richmond is and that sort of thing. Did play for Iowa, that has always had a very sound school and that sort of thing. Pass blocker and Mirror, this guy looks like a very strong fellow. Who knows if he does start right away just because of the 2 picks prior to him, but he looks like a very good depth piece, for a team that, really needed to address O-line. I'm going to give this an A- just because he may not see playing time right away. Ricky White, their last pick, a wide receiver. I like Ricky White. UNLV, not a big school at all, right? But, looks like he's very smart, gets into the blind spot a little bit. I think that you want kind of a guy like this that it's like, is tall enough, not big enough necessarily for outside, but is tall enough and that sort of thing. And, attack zone looks well, and, obviously very tough. So, makes defenders miss shifty. We saw a lot of undersized guys like this in this year's draft that make guys miss, which I think is, somewhat undervalued, and it's like, get the ball in these guys' hands and wide and out of the slot. And it's like, you can have 2 slot guys and, Ricky White, good on you to have that sort of hustle, and you get good value out of a guy like this where it's like he does have the potential to play a bit, next year, not having a super deep wide receiver core. So with that being said, I will give Ricky White an A as well. So overall, to me, the grade that I would be giving, this team, addressing their needs, I don't think edge was as big of a need as they thought. Center maybe would have been nice, but there was a good amount of linemen in this draft. And I think that the Seattle was like, we're not missing out on our chance to protect our QB and improve what was mostly underwhelming running game. I am going to give the Seattle Seahawks an A here because they did very, very, very well. And, I would have, I guess, liked to maybe see them go one of the guards as an actual guard, but one of these guys could, or maybe 2 of these guys could be playing guard at the beginning of the season. Now moving on to San Fran. We obviously, have their needs as tackle, which they didn't address, corner, edge, defensive tackle. Crazy to me how they don't have a single, offensive player on here besides tackle and center. Not to say, that sort of thing. And they draft Michael Williams off the edge. This guy was very intriguing. I think that he rose up boards mainly because his interviews were so damn good and that sort of thing. And a lot of teams just ended up liking him. And, I know some people think that this was a crazy reach of a pick. This guy is a dude you're probably not running around, to be completely honest with you, unless you've got some crazy O-line like the Eagles or something like that, you're probably not running past this guy with with excessive gains, and that sort of thing. And you put him opposite of Bosa, you're not going to want to run it by Bosa either. These guys take offense at that kind of crap. And I'll be real, I do think that, obviously with the Niners draft, they did draft, D tackles, interior D tackles, and that sort of thing. But Michael Williams, also a pretty decent pass rusher. He wasn't anything crazy flashy in the production, but he did enough to make it known that this guy isn't to be taken lightly, and he's not just going to be an uneventful end in the passing game and that sort of thing. So it's like this grade is definitely getting an A+. I know it might seem kind of high, but I really, really like Michael Williams. And I think that, being opposite Nick Bosa, I think this guy has the chance to really flourish under Saleh, And I mean, who knows better than like an all-around defense than, Robert Saleh. I know the Jets had a weird year last year, but, then you go to the second round and you get a big beef and Alfred Collins at 332 pounds, run-stuffing phenom right here, splits double teams, has a little bit of upside too. This kind of power is just, you don't want a guard who's undersized to match up with a guy like this. He will just be plowed over and that sort of thing. So they also say he can be an edge rusher. So it's interesting. It's like, what is Saleh going to run? For all we know, he might plug Collins on the outside, as like a sort of diversion type of thing, then put Michael inside, or who the heck knows, right? I'm also going to give this grade I'm going to give it an A. I'm not quite going to give it an A+, but I'm giving it an A. And that sort of thing. Moving on, we have Nick Martin, linebacker. I thought there was definitely a shot that this team might add a linebacker to pair with Fred Warner. Now, Fred Warner's a do-it-all guy. Nothing more needs to be said about it at a very high level. This guy, Nick Martin, is obviously undersized, and he had a season-ending knee injury, but he had a crazy number of tackles. An 83 solo tackles in the most by any player in the Big 12 since 2018. So he's obviously like a heat-seeking missile is, what the best way to classify Nick Martin. And that sort of thing. So, obviously, he had 6 sacks as well. I don't think Saleh's one of those guys to blitz these kind of guys often, but you never know if you're in a third and long, Nick Martin might be coming after you. And then a guy as good as Fred Warner is, he's going to be able to kind of pick up what's going on, and he's going to be able to diagnose the pass as well. And it's going to be a very deadly unit. I think that we're going to really see a resurgence of the Niners, much to my dismay, by the way, because I kind of relished that we didn't have to talk about the Niners all last year and how much of a cheat code McCaffrey was. Even though I would say I was sad about his injury because he's truly a special player. Nick Martin, I am going to give a B+ to this pick because I think this is kind of what they needed, a guy who can go and he can be kind of a gadget. It was kind of why I was mocking Jahad Campbell to these guys. at 11 for the longest time, but Michael Williams really just rose up the boards, unlike like maybe the most of any player in this draft, to be honest with you. But yeah, Nick Martin, this guy looks like he can be an anomaly, aggressive playmaker for them, which, I don't want, as they already have Bosa, to be honest with you. And then, however well Michael Williams does. Moving on to Upton Stout. What a name, obviously a smaller slot corner, even for his height, he's definitely, he's got decent size for that, excellent quickness and that sort of thing, undercuts routes and that sort of thing. And, that sort of thing. Ran a good 4.44, which I think, is enough, and that sort of thing. 6 interceptions in 3 seasons, pretty solid there. And obviously averaging good returns on there, kind of emphasizing that this guy gets the pick and then he's very shifty and hard to bring down, and that sort of thing. That's pretty rare that you average 30 per interceptions if you've got a good number of them like this, sort of thing. So this guy looks like a scrappy guy. I will say that I think that there was other DBs that maybe you could have went for, at this time and that sort of thing. But it's like, it's like all these other picks, and all of them have been defense. I think that Saleh knows what he's doing. And, maybe Upton Stout doesn't even play right away, but I guess, he's a 3rd round pick. So I honestly would lean towards him playing right away, but I think that they know what they're doing in San Fran, and they're looking to resurrect their name this year. I'm going to give this grade a B, just because I think that, it looks like a guy that can play the position, and he looks like an Energizer Bunny style, which is what you need at slot, and, I think sometimes these teams are afraid to go and get their slot early, and day 3, I still consider slightly early, day 2, late day 2, and, that sort of thing. CJ West, D tackle out of Indiana. I really like this. They grab, wouldn't it be wild if Collins and CJ West both started, at the beginning of the season, which, could be possible, right? He's obviously low to the ground and, that sort of thing at 6'1", but he's a stocky, strong guys. And that sort of thing. To be honest with you, with D tackles, I don't mind if they're a little bit shorter, just in the sense that it's like they can get underneath and overpower these linemen that it's like are, 6'2" and above, and that sort of thing. And it's just like sometimes these undersized guys fly literally under the radar and metaphorically. And I really like this pick. I do not mind that they doubled down on D tackle, because I do think it is a position need. And I like that they went with a bigger guy here after, getting another bigger guy, earlier, because I think that's what Saleh likes. I think that's what he liked on the Jets, with Quinnen Williams and, their D tackle situation. I think that they're maybe not trying to replicate it exactly, but, it looks close to it. And, those two guys, the 2 guys on the Jets were good for many, many years before their collapse last year of a poor season. So I'm going to give this, grade, just because we don't know if he's going to start right away. I'm going to give it a B+, just because I do think that D tackle was definitely a position of need. Now, Jordan Watkins, their first wide receiver that they drafted. Obviously, with this team, it's Ayuk and Pearsall and Jennings. And obviously, Jordan Watkins, more than likely to me, won't be starting unless he's, a crazy talent or whatever, and that sort of thing. He ran a 4.37, so he's a bit of a blazer. I will say that is kind of something that the Niners have been missing. They don't really have a blazer, for however many years, type of thing. These guys can get downfield and make chunk plays like Jennings, Ayuk, and then even Ricky Pearsall a little bit last year, with that Shanahan scheme. But, maybe this guy, comes in on certain, plays, that they need to stretch the field on. And, for that, he could be useful. I'm going to give this a B, though, just because I don't know how much time he's really going to get. And the thing about it is I worry about Purdy's deep ball, which was bad last year, and that sort of thing. That's one of the knocks on him, that it's like, unless he can develop a deep ball that's consistent and good, I don't trust Purdy to be throwing it downfield, and teams might also feel the same way. Jordan James, running back. We obviously know that McCaffrey was hurt most of last year with his tendonitis and that sort of thing. And obviously Mason left in free agency. I think they have, is it Garendo is his name, who I like, but they clearly need other running backs. Because you lose. What if McCaffrey can't play this year? I don't know how serious this is. And we know we're not going to know from the Niners whether or not he's playing, but obviously 205, 5'10", a stockier guy and that sort of thing. Speed of, feet speed and that sort of thing, breaks tackles and has good top end speed. So he really, he looks like he's very shifty from side to side. And that's what I've said about a lot of these guys in this draft, is that they're very shifty, but this looks like a guy who will be a nice addition. I do think halfback is a position of need. This might even be like that, hey, what if McCaffrey's hurt a lot, or he's just not able to go like he was used to? Maybe this is a contingency pick for later years, which I think is always smart for teams in a position that, you're dead in the water if you don't have any sort of like plan for, every position, to be honest with you. And last year it was proven that, these teams can really suffer without a good back, and McCaffrey was the prime, example of a team that fell from grace because of, just one guy not being there on offense. So I'm going to give this pick an A-, just because we may not see him play right away, but, we'll see. Marquez Sigel, a safety. So obviously Sigel, this guy looks a lot like Justin Jefferson. I just had a weird moment there, you guys. But this guy's a safety, 5'11", 199, prototypical, I guess, free safety size and that sort of thing. And they did lose Hafanga, in the off season and that sort of thing. 123 tackles. I think that's really, really good. Does play slot, and that sort of thing. Did run the fastest 40-yard dash and that sort of thing, which is kind of surprising because we had Emin Wari, obviously. But, obviously he looks like he's very good from the slot and that sort of thing. And he catches it with his hands. He looks like a player that really plays aggressively, which I know that the Niners, they want that on their team and that sort of thing. So he also had the most special teams tackles. So this looks like a pick of insane value at a position of need as well. I know they don't have it here, but they do have cornerback. This looks like a sneaky sort of pick that it's like is a very much a Niner pick where they're like, oh, we address, what might not be a crazy apparent need, but that with a guy that can also do, great things. And Marcus Sigel, I think this looks like a good value pick to me and a guy, and I'm going to give this a B+. Curtis Rourke, QB. This was interesting. I don't think at all that this means that Purdy may not be on the team type of thing. He has good size and, and he played for Indiana and he played for Ohio type of thing, obviously had a very, very good completion percentage. So he kind of fits what Shanahan would like in a guy to just be very, very, very accurate. 29 touchdown passes, very, very good, for the Hoosiers. And Obviously, a tall guy, 6'4", 220. This guy looks like, he can be the athletic dude you want, with the strong arm and that sort of thing. And he played on a torn ACL. Okay, that is wild. But obviously, as a QB, maybe that solidifies him as a pocket passer type of thing. But obviously, this is a dude who maybe, oh my goodness, imagine in the 7th round if this guy eventually started, or they got a trade chip for him. I'm going to say this. For this pick, I'm going to give a B+. Just because it seems wild that he played and he's coming off a torn ACL, but he's not coming off of it because he played. And he looks like a guy that could maybe be molded, and it's like, who knows what's going to happen with Purdy. So it's an even better pick. But, looking at their last 2 picks, we have Connor Colby, a guard, a big guard, 6'6", 309, tall, I guess. He's not like super, super big, but he did play, both spots, very good in the running game. So zone heavy run schemes, I really, really like this. And he played for Iowa, a big school. I'm going to give this just because I do know that they need a guard on this team, and that sort of thing. And they just lost Banks, but I'm going to give this grade an A-. I think that we don't have much here, and I really don't know who Connor Colby is, all that much. But to get him in the late 7th round, position rank of 21, I think that's good value at the very least of a guy that can, maybe be plug and play at guard. And then we do have one more wide receiver. We have Junior Bergen. So Junior Bergen out of Montana, obviously, a reach with nothing over here, you guys. So I don't even know his height. I really need to go in. I need to actually look at this guy. So he's 5'11", 184, went to Montana. Nothing else on him. So, just because it's Shanahan, it's Lynch, these guys draft and they do a very good job. And it's like that sort of thing. I'm going to say, so he even rushed for 493 yards. Oh, he moved from running back to wide receiver. And he turns into a running back after the catch. So this guy looks like, but he's smaller in size. So I'm just wondering, 5'11", 184, is he quick? He must be crazy quick or something like that. So it's interesting. You wonder if they drafted him for a specific reason. I'm probably talking crazy talk at this point, you guys, because yeah, he's a 7th round pick and he's a crazy late pick too. So with that being said, I'm going to give, what am I giving this pick? I do think it's important that they added depth of wide receiver, even though they say it's not a need, and that sort of thing. I am going to say that pick would be, a B-, just because of like the rest that they drafted. And he kind of, I don't know, you might not get that much value out of him at all, until like someone else leaves. Or, maybe Ayuk just return to the way he was, which would just be sad on the contract he's on. But overall, for the Niners, they obviously had a stacked draft with a lot of picks. They didn't address tackle. Perhaps, they're going to address it with Connor Colby, who they drafted in the 7th round. Wouldn't that be miraculous? A guy who played tackle, we'll pick up our tackle in the 7th round and he'll play opposite Trent Williams. And he is a taller guy. So who knows? Overall, I'm going to give this draft, I'm going to give it a B+. I think that the NFC West had a very strong class of draftees this year. And don't worry, in my other videos, I'm not going to be praising every single pick. There were definitely some picks that I was like, what in What were you thinking when you had these other guys on the board? But I want to thank you guys for watching my NFC West, breakdown and grades of every single team in the NFC West. And I want to thank you all for watching. And as always, go Pack Go.